Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to where we left off in class, talking about the guillotine and the upcoming thing known as the Reign of Terror, right? We are getting into the point of the French Revolution where we are all up in the radical phase, right? We are now at the point where we are looking at mass executions. Trying to get away from counter-revolutionaries, trying to prevent accusations, the usurpation of power and things like that by people like Maximilien Robespierre, right? We talked a little bit about the Committee of Public Safety and several other things. Just to give you a heads up, there were multiple different committees as a part of the National Convention, much like there are committees in our modern-day government, small subgroups and stuff like that. For example, Jean-Paul Marat, not on the Committee of Public Safety. He was on this thing called the Committee of Surveillance, right, where he actually was tasked with the idea of surveilling people and bringing lists to Danton and Robespierre of people who needed to be sent to this bad boy right here, the guillotine, right? And a guillotine is going to be popped up in almost every single major French city. Every single French city would have a guillotine. They would use it to have revolutionary tribunals and have people executed in that, of course, swift and effective way. It's bright red color serving as a symbol of the radical phase of the revolution. You're going to see numerous people get marched on their way to the guillotine. For example, like we said during the earlier part of class, Lavoisier, the very famous French chemist that Miss Rivette told y'all so much about, did actually end up being executed during the Reign of Terror due to the fact of the company and the group that he was a part of earlier on in his life, which was called the Farmers General, which was in charge of collecting taxes before the revolution ever began. So it was believed that he was stained with this disgusting stench of French tax collection and of overexertion of authority, right? So the Reign of Terror that begins with the execution of Louis XVI really brings on an extreme moment in time. First of all, the French are still at war, right? The First Coalition War, the War of the First Coalition, does not end until 1797. So going forward, the Committee of Public Safety not only is still at war, but wants to really kind of kick the war into high gear, but they also start changing a lot of stuff. Mainly to keep the sans-culottes and also of the revolutionary poor as happy as they possibly can. Because they like the violence that these people enjoy. They like the ability to be able to have this giant stream of executions that are being marched into the city center. First big thing they do to keep the sans-culottes happy is they create the very first true socialist-based system, creating what is known as a planned economy. As in, economies and prices are going to be set directly by the Committee of Public Safety and then also the Committee of General Security. Now, the big thing about it, though, is, for example, they created this thing known as the bread of equality, right? The bread of equality would have a very strict price, would have no sawdust or things, ingredients and things like that in there. The problem is, with this planned economy, is that the Committee of Public Safety is ignoring simple economic rules that have to do with price fluctuations due to supply and demand. So, bread is not supposed to be a stagnant price. It does have to fluctuate given the amount of wheat that is available to make it. The less wheat that's available to make it, the price of bread does go up. But to try and prevent bread riots and revolts that were super emblematic of France before the revolution, they create this planned economy or this emergency socialism. So, granted, it keeps the sans-culottes happy, gives them something to eat while they're sitting in the crowd watching these executions as they were invited to come and watch them. But also, it's an element of total warfare, right? So the Committee of Public Safety also then begins to go towards this thing known as total warfare. Total warfare is where every single, jot this down, it's where all of a country's things, its goods, its farmable items, its things made in factories are going to begin to be funneled into a war effort, right? If you are a cloth maker, your cloth, a percentage of your cloth is now going to the military in the terms of the war effort. If you make bread, certain amounts of that bread is going to the military in terms of the war effort, right? That is that emergency socialism idea, the idea of sending all of our goods to either our poor or our war, right? And this really truly begins that era known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror really begins in January of 1793 and lasts up until about June of 1794, okay? So it only lasts for about a year, but it's a cataclysmic year in French history because the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794 is really kind of emblemized as this series of trials that ruled with absolute dictatorial power. The goal of this was to hunt down the people that were believed to be enemies of the revolutions, to hunt down nobles who were in France that were still leading small mercenary mercenary armies against revolutionary forces, to hunt down people in the countryside who were speaking ill of the revolution. And in the long run, what you're going to see is the arrest of about 100,000 people, or 300,000 people in France, and possibly the execution of 40,000. Now, when you look at the grand numbers, it's hard to keep track of and everything like that. But basically, Robespierre, Danton, and Marat are going to work together to lead an army and a parade of prominent and not so prominent people to be executed by the guillotine in various different French cities. Now, 40,000, give or take, were not directly executed by the guillotine. About 16 to 20,000 are going to be executed by the guillotine, and then possibly some number as close to 20,000 died in prisons due to gross mistreatment and being arrested by the Reign of Terror / the Committee of Public Safety / the Committee of General Security. Now, 300,000 would be accused and processed through the criminals' actions as well, and their revolutionary trials would be considered like big shows to show that anybody who goes against the revolution could be possibly executed. Now, this was used to try and help stop the counter-revolutionaries that were going on in the countryside. Now, some of the smaller cities throughout France were beginning to turn away from the revolution. They were starting to turn towards things like open economics, trading with the British, trading with the Austrians and the Prussians, and basically ignoring the ideas coming out of Paris during the revolution. One very famous city that did this was known as Toulon, like Toulon. Write them down. They're going to come up a little bit later, especially when we get into the Napoleon stuff. But Toulon literally ignores the series of edicts that are coming out of the Committee of Public Safety and begins to try and openly trade with the British and use the British army to try and help defend their city. Now, the Jacobins are also going to even use this moment to suppress many of the female rights that were gained during the revolution. Olympe de Gaulle would be guillotined during this time period, the woman who actually wrote the Declaration on the Rights of Women, the woman who was also considered a Girondin sympathizer, right? And so if you were a Girondinist or somebody who supported the party that was not the Jacobins, you could easily be executed. Or if you went against the Montagnards, of course, the group of people that included Marat, Robespierre, and Danton that sat on their higher benches and went against their ideas, you could be executed. Much like the Girondinists that were actually scooped up from the National Convention and brought in front of the revolutionary tribunals as not being aggressive enough or being the martyrs of liberty, as like literally Robespierre called himself, right? So like now going forward though, they didn't just stop there. They changed even more stuff. Apparently, the Committee of Public Safety during this time period is going to set that equality of bread price, going to have emergency socialism, total warfare. But on top of everything else, they even changed how time was kept inside of France. They changed the names of the days of the week. They changed the units of weight and measurement. They changed the name of all of the months of the year, and they brought the revolution to what was known as Year One. Right? So basically the way it looked was in 1793, that was considered year one of the new France. And then 1794 was considered year two of the new France. No 1793, no 1794 anymore, just year one and year two. And you notice that Maximilien Robespierre and Danton are changing it to the time when they actually took control, right? So like, of course, because remember conveniently, Louis XVI is going to be executed in January, that first month of 1793. So like in all the like months had goofy names, and there was only 10 of them with like 30 days, so the calendar was off and stuff like that. And also all of the days, or all the weeks had 6 days, because they outlawed Sundays. I'm not kidding. The Committee of Public Safety outlawed Sundays in this process known as de-Christianization, where they basically are trying to lead France away from anything that was emblematic of the old France. One big part of that is the Catholic faith. So basically, Robespierre, Danton, and Marat worked together to outlaw the Catholic faith in France. This is absolutely bananas, right? You got Marquis de Lafayette locked up in a prison somewhere, and you got these guys creating a new church called the Cult of the Supreme Being. Jot that down, the Cult of the Supreme Being, where they were like, nobody is Catholic anymore. Now they follow the Cult of the Supreme Being, which is supposed to be a brand new type of religion that was going to be headquartered and actually function under the Reign of Terror as the new faith of France. And on top of this, what do you do with all those old places like Notre Dame? Robespierre wanted to turn Notre Dame into a flea market, right? Turn it into a shopping area so people didn't have to actually go and pray there on Sundays, which were also now outlawed, right? It's absolutely bananas what's going on. And interestingly enough, we did have a guy during the Reign of Terror that was capturing some of these key moments, right? Some of these key moments were being captured during this nationalistic explosion by this man right here, a man by the name of Jacques Louis David. And what's really interesting about Jacques-Louis David is the fact that he is a famous painter during the French Revolution who was still living in France during the Revolution and was capturing some of the most major moments of the Revolution. He was capturing the moments of nationalism exploding and painting them through his artworks and showing that, like, literally people from France were running off to fight wars for the new revolution, and that the Committee of Public Safety is trying to crush any kind of counter-revolutionary movement going on during the revolution, leading people to executions, having 30,000 people somewhere in the neighborhood of, having them executed and things like that. And also, he's very famous for capturing the death of one of the most famous figures of the French Revolution. This is Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Marat, right? So, like, that's right, we're seeing some things start to crumble apart as the, like, poop hits the fan. So what's going on right now is, I'm sorry, that was terrible singing on my part, but that right there is the man, Jean-Paul Marat. And as you can see, he is super dead. So now, like, what ended up occurring, though, in real life is this woman named Charlotte Coudray apparently actually snuck into Marat's room while he was in his medical bath. So remember, Marat had to sit in a medical bath, sometimes for like upwards of 6 hours a day, to try and help the skin disease that he had acquired from living in the sewers of France while he was on the run when he was writing his newspaper, La Ému des Peuples, which is, of course, the friend of the people. Now, what happened, though, was Charlotte Coudray, who is a female Girondin sympathizer, was actually tired and absolutely disgusted with the names that kept popping up in his newspaper, and was disgusted with the fact that he kept announcing the names of people to be arrested and executed. So she snuck into his room, and while he was actually in his bathtub, she stabbed him multiple times, right? And apparently, while standing on the stand being accused of murder of Marat, she said, "I killed one to save thousands." And then she was summarily then executed by the guillotine. But the famous piece of The Death of Marat evokes an intensity and a sadness and kind of an unseen death of the violent face of the revolution. Because as in Marat's hand right here, because he would do some of his writing from his bath, this right here is a list of names to be published in his La Ému des Peuples, discussing the new names that would be put onto the guillotine and those who would be executed. And as you can see right here, this entire piece is absolutely beautiful, and apparently it's in Belgium, and I want to see it so bad. I also want a poster of this so badly, but I gotta find one, which is the hard part. Now, the cool thing about it, though, also, that's not him. Ignore that. That's Eugene Delacroix. That's a mess up on my part. Now, the thing about it, though, is The Death of Marat, that extreme, intense piece, is showing that basically the underbelly of this revolution is kind of bubbling up, right? Now, interesting little fact as well is the Marat will die even before she does, right? So Marat actually dies in, I believe, April of 1793 after being killed by Charlotte Coudray, and then now we're only left with Danton and Robespierre. Danton and Robespierre, though, also in October of 1793, send Marie Antoinette off to be guillotined after she had to listen to the abuse of her son. And what ended up happening, why she ended up being guillotined, is because they forced her son to go on the stand and say that Marie Antoinette assaulted him when in fact she did not. Basically, what the Committee of, and I'm sorry about this, Rufino, but what the Committee of Public Safety did is they put Marie Antoinette on trial, and as icing on the cake for the case against her, they told her son, if you do not do this, and if you do not tell the people here at this trial what we're going to tell you, then we will kill you and your sisters, right? So, because he had two siblings that were in this jail with them, right? And they would beat him in front of Marie Antoinette where she could see him, and he would cry out for his mother all the time, and she could not get to him. So she led a disgusting, torturous final days of her life. And then she had to watch her son tell a room full of people who were shouting at her and yelling at her and screaming at her and throwing things at her, that apparently she sexually assaulted her son when she never actually did do that, right? So she never did it. And then she will have her hair shaven off of her head, and she will be put in ragged clothes and be walked out to the guillotine. And this right here is a drawing of Marie Antoinette on her way to the guillotine, who actually is like, this is drawn by Jacques Louis David because he was in the crowd when it happened. And she was walked summarily up to the top of the guillotine, and her very last words were, "I'm sorry," because she stepped on the executioner's foot on her way to the actual guillotine itself. Now, fun fact, though, also, she never said, "Let them eat cake." First and foremost, if she ever did say, "Let them eat cake," she wouldn't have said, "Let them eat cake." She would have said, "Let them eat brioche," because brioche is like a food for fancy people. But also, the very first time that that's actually even going to be written down anywhere is well after she's already dead. So she never actually said that at all. She was really just executed as a symbol of the monarchy by Robespierre and Danton, especially after Marat is going to die earlier that year from being stabbed to death. So as you can see, the Reign of Terror is just getting absolutely bananas right now because everything is just blowing out of proportion. And what's going on top of all of this is the following year, in early 1794, what ends up going down is that basically Robespierre passes a new law where someone can just be accused of going against the revolution, and all you need after that point is just basically to be like, oh yeah, we're going to accuse you of going against the revolution, and bang, you're going to be guillotined, right? So like, there's like no proper trial process or due process or habeas corpus. People are just being executed in mass by Robespierre and Danton. There is only one thing that Robespierre and Danton's National Convention did that was positive. And it all had to do with the revolution that was going on in Saint-Domingue. Remember, I told you we were going to come back to this, right? So during the revolutionary craziness that's going on in France, again, the revolutionaries back in Haiti hear about this, and they hear about the rise of the Reign of Terror. And this man, Toussaint Louverture, who has been educated in Enlightenment ideas by his former slave owners, and he knows how to read, he knows how to write, and he has studied French military and artillery movements, actually trains a slave revolt and brings them to power and leads a massive, well-organized slave revolt on the island of Saint-Domingue. And on top of all that, he was given money by the British and the Spanish to try and help the slave revolt keep going, because the British and the Spanish wanted to try and basically create an economic system with Saint-Domingue at the forefront, right? And so Toussaint Louverture leads this entire rebellion, and to try and stop this rebellion, rights were given back to free people of color, and the National Convention under Robespierre and Danton actually outlawed slavery, which is absolutely crazy. They outlawed slavery not only in Saint-Domingue, but in many of the other colonies as well, saying the right of freedom and liberty extends to all people, not just people back in France. And this was mainly, though, probably to prevent the colony from falling into British hands. A lot of this has to do with the fact that the French East India Company is failing, right? So, like, that's right. I said it. The French had an East India Company, and by the late 1790s, due to the ridiculousness that's happening in France and the revolution, its economic value is going down. It's plummeting. It's being replaced by the Dutch and the British, right? And so because of this, though, to try and keep it from failing completely and keep the sugar trade that's going on in Saint-Domingue alive, the British actually lose out, because with the freedom of people and the outlawing of slavery in Saint-Domingue, Louverture switches sides back to France, right? And helps fend off the British and the Spanish, even though he was actually made an officer in the Spanish military. And we'll come back to Saint-Domingue a little bit again later on and talk a little more about Toussaint Louverture, maybe a little bit about his right-hand man, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. But like, the big thing about it is the National Convention is going to actually outlaw slavery during this time period, mainly just as an economic value kind of thing. But then, on top of everything else, you got this thing called the Thermidorian reaction, right? And you got the rise of the thing called the Directory. So this is going to be the last slide that we talk about today. Now, the big thing about it is, during this movement of Robespierre passing a law where someone can just be accused of talking bad about the revolution and the guillotine, he's doing this on purpose, because Robespierre, during this part of the revolution, is growing very, very paranoid. And he's also growing a lot of critics as well. And people are beginning to criticize him, saying, we can't just keep giving more blood to the people of France. We have to eventually be able to give them a country with proper liberty. And some of these critics begin to be brought in and executed as well. Because Robespierre has the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security at his back. He has these people that are actually saying, well, we outnumber you, so we're just going to keep executing you. But when he grows paranoid of his own people, that's when things start to go kind of sideways. He actually has Georges Danton, one of his closest allies, executed because Georges Danton tells him, we need to relent on the mass executions, and we need to focus on the war effort and focus on the happiness of the people rather than their bloodlust. And because he was trying to tell Robespierre how to do things differently, Danton would then be executed as well. Marched up to the guillotine and executed in front of everyone. So now Robespierre's paranoia is taking over, right? And what ends up happening is he executes many other people that are closely connected to the other party members inside the National Convention. Even some of those Jacobins. Apparently, several of them were disgusted at Robespierre's willingness to execute women left and right, regardless of anything that they did or did not do. He had women executed at one point because apparently a woman was showing up to his home carrying a couple of knives, and he said that she was trying to assassinate her. Now, the woman did actually admit to the fact that she wanted to assassinate Robespierre, just like Charles Coudray had actually assassinated Marat, but then he goes on a mad spree of executing noble women and many other people. And several of the other officers begin to stand up and say, this guy is getting out of control. We need to calm him. We need to stomp him down, and we need to bring peace back to the revolution and actually get our feet back on the ground. And so many of the people that supported Robespierre early on begin to conspire against him, and they hold a secret meeting, right? They hold a secret meeting without Robespierre or any of his allies nearby, and they actually call for Robespierre's arrest. Now, this event is known as the Thermidorian reaction, right? Now, Thermidor is the basically French for the hot month, right? So it's not named necessarily after a club. Thermidorians are people who actually supported the arrest of Robespierre, right? So they rush in to the Thermidorian, or the Thermidorians create this little regime. They rush in to actually arrest Robespierre and all of his allies. And when they get in there, not only do they throw some of Robespierre's friends out of a window, they defenestrate people and kill them. Not only do some of them get beaten senselessly, who actually die of their injuries later, but Robespierre gets arrested in a very chaotic way, right? They rush up to Robespierre, and apparently somewhere in the scuffle when they actually assembled outside of the Hotel des Invalides, which is where he is, and that's not the Hotel des Invalides, it's a little bit of it's a different building actually that this happened in. He was sitting up inside of a parlor room in the second floor, and what ends up going on, as you can see, the windows are open right here, and you can see someone being thrown out of the window right there. You can actually see as well the men rushing in to arrest him. Now, there are two different opinions on what happened that night in that arrest. But we do know that no matter what opinion you listen to, Robespierre ended up with a hole in his face, right? And this is going to be one of those really, really good body parts that we get to add, because what happened to Robespierre's face is a bullet apparently went into his mouth and went out of the side of his face, destroying his entire lower jaw, right? And you can actually see right here one of the two believed opinions. Now, some say that Robespierre took a pistol, put it in his mouth, and was going to commit suicide like one of his other members did, who's actually sitting right here on the floor, but that Robespierre's arm got hit, or that he punked out, and then he shot right here, and the bullet came out of the side of his face. But there's another person, a French officer, who says he pointed a gun at Robespierre and that the bullet happened to go through his mouth and then out the side of his face. But what we do very, very well know is that basically Robespierre ended up with a disgusting injury to the side of his face. That basically he had to sit there with a handkerchief bound around his face all the time to keep his jaw from falling down all the time. And so this is Robespierre sitting up with all the people who arrested him sitting around him with blood oozing out of his face. And then he would be brought in front of the actual new Thermidorian regime who was trying to bring peace to the entire thing, and in front of all these people he would be brought up on his arrest warrants. And he did all of this from a laid position because he couldn't stand, because he would get lightheaded every time he got up because of the hole in the side of his face. And after about a couple of weeks, he would be marched up to the guillotine looking like this. That is what Robespierre looked like when they marched him up to the guillotine on the way to his execution, with that handkerchief around his mouth. When the executioner had to prepare him to be guillotined by the people, who, by the way, guess what the people are acting like in the crowd? They're cheering for his execution. The sans-culottes were like, we never liked you. We just wanted this to keep going. And then basically they're freaking out and ecstatic about the execution that's about to happen to this man. They took the handkerchief off his face though because the executioner had to prepare his neck is what it's called. And they pushed it down like this, and apparently he screamed for the entire time because of the pain that was being caused to his face. All right, so like, I know, it's intense, ain't it? So that's a crazy, crazy intense story. But what does end up happening, though, is the Thermidorian regime comes in following the death of the Robespierre, and that's when the economic controls begin to soften. It's where they actually arrested most of Robespierre's sympathizers and the Committee of Public Safety's sympathizers and had them executed to try and bring ease to the entire people. A lot of people were beginning to grow tired of the violence as well. And many of the Sans-Culottes members were looking for an economy that could actually suit them without the royal privilege, without the nobles and all these other things. So power is going to pass under yet another constitution that gets written, which is like taking the Declaration of the Rights of Man and editing it a little bit, and they would actually create a new government, right? And that new government would have a national convention, but it would be led by a 5-man executive branch. Kind of like the idea would be like having 5 presidents, right? So you have an odd number so one of them can veto the others or actually can be swayed into an uneven vote. And they create this to try and create a dictatorial power, but there's going to be one guy that shows up a little bit later and who overthrows the Directory. And his name is none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. And we will start talking about him in class. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.